Out of 100 questions, 99 times the answer is money. Most wars, as Julian Assange once said, aren't about someone winning. They're about lasting. That's where the profit lies. Wars are expensive and they have to be financed by banks. The financial sector is always an accomplice. Those who control the central banks also control the media.
Where do you see evidence today that Germans are the most brainwashed people?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person. Hallo bei Gegen den Strom.
About the guest. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. I survived, says Kolja Spöri. He's traveled through 193 countries, including some of the most dangerous places in the world, and he's written a book about it, titled I Survived. Kolja Spöri has sat down with U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He's had contact with the sitting U.S. President, Donald Trump. He's been out in the field with FARC rebels in Colombia and knows Chirurg, the leader of the Russian biker gang, the Night Wolves. Welcome, Kolja Spöri.
Thank you very much for the invitation. What draws you to war zones and crisis areas? Originally, my goal was to travel to every country in the world. I actually managed to do that at some point, and inevitably, that means you end up in difficult places, in regions affected by conflict or crisis. Early on, I realized that what we're told in our media, or even through government travel warnings, doesn't really match what you experience on the ground. So over time, I became more and more interested in war and crisis regions, because I wanted to see things for myself and to search for the truth about what's really happening there.
I once had a conversation with a bomb disposal expert. I asked him, what goes through your mind when you're working on a live mine? And he said, nothing. If something were going through my mind, I'd already be dead. How do you feel in a moment of greatest danger?
I was never in as much danger as a bomb disposal expert, at least not knowingly. Of course, I've had some experiences during my travels. Recently, by the way, I was in Azerbaijan, in the Karabakh region, which is the most heavily mined area in the world. There, at the invitation of the government, we had the chance to watch a mine-clearing team at work and even witness a controlled detonation. That was incredibly impressive. The blast and the shockwave are just unbelievable. And those were only anti-personnel mines. You can hardly imagine what it must be like when a tank mine goes off.
I experienced that once, in Prizren, in Kosovo, back in 1999, when some Albanians tried to blow up a Serbian monastery using a ring of tank mines. Only one of them went off. But even 100 meters away, the windows shattered inward, and I found myself lying on the bed, surrounded by shards of glass. How was it for you? What kind of situation did you experience?
The most defining and dangerous moments for me, the ones that really stayed with me, were in Somalia. I had two experiences there. I had organized a relief transport to the refugee camps in Dadaab, in eastern Kenya. That's where the largest refugee camp in the world is, and at the time it was in the headlines because of an alleged major drought disaster. On the way there, I was driving myself when we ran into an ambush, either by Al-Shabaab or maybe just regular bandits, the so-called Shifta. I can't say for sure. There was a car blocking the road ahead of us, just around a curve on a desert road. There were 4 or 5 young guys with Kalashnikovs, but they weren't pointing them at us. They were hanging around closer to the car, assuming we'd slow down anyway. I didn't give them that satisfaction. I was already driving fast, and I sped past them along the soft sand at the edge of the road, huge cloud of dust. The danger was over before it had really begun. But back then, that area was potentially very dangerous. Were you under fire? gunfire. Yes, that was the most intense shooting I ever experienced.
Das Maximum, was ich an Beschuss erlebt habe. Und ich muss auch an der Stelle sagen, ich suche nicht, wie
And I have to say, I'm not someone who goes looking for extreme
extreme
experiences, like some people who chase that kind of thrill, seeing bodies, seeing blood, witnessing combat firsthand. I've been to the Donbass, to Donetsk, 3 times in total. Each time, I heard shelling, artillery fire. On my 3rd visit, I was in a trench, wearing full protective gear. 6 artillery shells and mortar rounds were fired in our direction, though none of them hit us. For someone like me, who's never even served in the military, I have to admit, that was enough to make me afraid.
Genügt mir, Angst zu machen, muss ich gestehen.
When you're traveling through war zones and crisis areas like you do, fear is always your companion. How do you deal with that?
Wie gehen Sie damit um?
Für mich ist es ganz wichtig, die Angst nicht
For me, it's really important not to let fear take control. Basically, I believe that the moment you show weakness, you become a target. It's the same with street crime. Often it's about not looking like a victim. And when it comes to war zones or areas that could be dangerous because of conflict, I always try to establish a contact in advance, someone with a certain authority in that region, so I have a kind of safety card to play if things go wrong.
So dass ich einen Joker habe für den Fall der Fälle. Und wenn ich das einmal nicht habe, dann versuche ich zumindest.
And if I don't have that information, I at least try to find out through the media who the strong man in that area is, so that at a roadblock I could use that name to bluff. The basic principle is project strength. Then it's about what happens if you find yourself in a situation where you're confronted, for example, by criminals. I don't let those guys intimidate me. My life has value. I don't get caught off guard easily, and that's something I make clear. That's why I've always tried to show dominance, done in a friendly way. And with just a few exceptions, which I was able to handle, I've never been run over or turned into a pawn by bad people.
Bösen Leuten geworden.
Würden Sie den Satz einer mir bekannten
Would you agree with a line from a psychoanalyst I know? Fear, it's what we should be afraid of. Perfect. Do you also feel fear when you look at the current developments in the war of aggression against Iraq, which violates international law?
gegen den Iran anschauen?
Ich bin jetzt 56 Jahre alt. Man gewöhnt sich fast schon an die
I'm 56 years old now. You almost get used to the illegal wars of aggression carried out by the Americans and everyone who belongs to that system. I think the first time I really became aware of it was during the war in Yugoslavia. Before that, there had already been the attack on Libya. That must have been back in the 80s. Unfortunately, this is the system we live in, where we, as Germans associated with the West, are constantly told through the media that we're the good guys. In reality, we're a vassal of the bad ones. And the current attack on Iran is just a continuation of the countless wars of aggression waged by the West. In the end, we Germans are also victims of wars that have been waged against us.
Opfer von Kriegen, die gegen uns geführt worden sind.
Der Enthauptungsschlag.
The decapitation strike against Iran has failed. How do you assess the current state of this conflict?
Die Berichterstattung,
The reporting, which as always differs a lot between mainstream media and what you can hear in well-informed social media, suggests right now that this war isn't a quick decapitation strike, but will drag on. That Iran is holding its own, quite respectably against the attackers. Of course, I hope Iran can stand its ground as best it can. The question is, though, how reliable our information really is. There's a lot of AI being used. At first, it was suggested that Israel's entire leadership had been eliminated, Netanyahu, Mossad chief Barnea, or Ben Gvir. But they've all reappeared. That's psychological warfare, too. Many things can only be judged afterward. We'll know them by their fruits, but I'm rooting for the Iranian people, hoping they don't become a vassal state the way we have.
ein Vassal werden, so wie wir es geworden sind.
Der iranische Politikwissenschaftler Marandi.
The Iranian political scientist Marandi recently said in an interview that the war against Iran has become an asymmetric conflict, one that's being timed and calibrated by Iran, by Tehran. And the goal, he said, is to cut off the oxygen supply to Western financial markets and Western connectivity. Would you agree with that view?
Die Luft abzudrehen. Würden Sie das so sehen?
Das ist der Eindruck, der sich vermittelt derzeit.
That's the impression we're getting right now, that Iran has actually become the one setting the pace of this war. I have to say, I'd like it if that were true, if the US and Israel were really taking a hit here. It does look that way, and we can feel it too, for example in gas prices, that this is having economic effects on the West. The way things are developing, it could well be that the war is meant to last a long time. And that's true for both sides, because, as Julian Assange once said, most wars aren't about someone winning, they're about lasting. That's where the profit lies. So what does that mean? That wars are really about lasting?
Was bedeutet das? Die Kriege gehen darum, dass sie dauern.
Das bedeutet, dass sehr viel Geld verdient wird.
That means a lot of money is being made, first and foremost, by the military-industrial complex. One example where we can see, and have to see, the continuation of a war that could have ended very quickly is Ukraine. This war could have been over in a week. The question, of course, is what do we mean by the war? In fact, it started back in 2014, but let's say we're talking about the shooting war. The Russian operation began in early 2022, and I had friends from Chechnya who were on the ground near Kyiv. They expected to move into Kyiv and end the war very quickly by, as they put it, cutting off the head of the snake. And then, apparently, there were instructions, first from the Israeli foreign minister at the time, Bennett, and then probably from the former British Prime Minister, telling both sides in the war that it should continue and last longer. Now, it's already been 4 years. And based on what my Chechen friends told me, who later pulled back and didn't go to fight again, it would have been possible to end the war quickly. Wars are meant to drag on. There's a lot of money to be made from them. And basically what's happening in Ukraine right now is one big act of plunder.
Who's making money from the war against Iran, and how exactly are they doing it?
In the West, of course, it's the arms manufacturers. On the Iranian side, we see a similar phenomenon. Weapons systems are apparently being supplied there as well, probably by China. Their goal isn't to maximize income, it's primarily about geopolitical interests, I think. The main driving force behind wars is also the credit that has to be granted to the parties involved so they can even wage those wars. Because wars are expensive, and they have to be financed by banks. And when a company like BlackRock now takes over half of Ukraine's agriculture, that's a typical banker's war. One part of it, at least. The same goes for the Americans supporting a completely drained, bankrupt system, where bankers, especially the central banks, play a very important role. And we see this pattern in every war. Those who finance the wars don't just profit from them. They can also decide who wins.
Nicht nur verdienen, sie können auch entscheiden, wer gewinnt.
Sowohl im Ukraine-Krieg als auch
in both the war in Ukraine and the war against Iran, as well as in other conflicts, the British government has been a driving force. And the City of London, the financial center in London, is the key hub of the global financial system. How is money being made there from the conflict with Iran? What levers are at play? You were in London recently, that's why I'm asking.
Sie waren in London unterwegs, deswegen frage ich.
Ja, ich war durch meine Tätigkeit in der Formel 1.
Yes, back in my Formula One days, I used to be in London quite a lot. Later on, I spent about a year working as a consultant for a company connected to MI6, specializing in travel security for very wealthy clients. It was actually a spin-off from MI6. Now, the City of London, something your viewers probably know, is an extraterritorial area. It doesn't really belong to England in the usual sense, so it operates under its own rules. All the major banks are based there. I took a close look at how everything works. And well, There are a few myths around it, like a certain stone that's supposed to stay right where it is.
Es gibt auch ein paar Mythen, einen gewissen Stein, der da liegen bleiben muss. Ich glaube, der Coronation Stone. Wenn
I
der
believe that
da
if the
wäre,
coronation stone were no longer there, the power of the City of London would disappear with it. The mechanisms that finance these wars are not something I can personally lay out, like which banks in the City of London are profiting from the current war in Iran. I'd have to speculate on that. But the big players include, for example, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and countless others based there. The Rothschild Bank, where I once worked, of course, is among them too.
Die Rothschild Bank, für die ich mal tätig war, natürlich auch.
Sie waren ja lange in London auch tätig gewesen.
You spent quite a bit of time working in London, and in the City of London there are major insurance companies that also insure ships, and are now, of course, feeling the impact of the war. There are war financiers, lenders who are obviously profiting from this conflict, and there are also companies, including banks and investors, that hold options on commodity futures for oil and gas, and they're now reacting. Do you know how these mechanisms work? I mean, the whole issue that
Die Thematik, dass die City of London Warenströme insbesondere auf dem
The City of London controls trade flows, especially at sea. I've seen that with my own eyes in Somalia, specifically in Puntland, at the Horn of Africa. That was connected to the phenomenon of piracy there, which ties directly to your question. I was in Bosaso, by the way, under the protection of Blackwater personnel. That company is now called Constellus, and I was able to observe on site and was also told that piracy became a larger phenomenon after the British government had trained, equipped, and funded a local coast guard there. The locals who served in that coast guard later turned into criminals. They turned rogue is the technical term you often come across when terrorist or pirate organizations emerge.
Immer wieder findet, wenn irgendwelche Terror- oder Piratenorganisationen sich bilden. Und die City of London hatte
And apparently, the City of London always had a certain level of control over those pirates. Through what's called a strategy of tension, flows of goods, raw materials, and often even migration are managed or influenced. And I know from a friend who worked for the insurer Lloyd's in England that there was at least a rumor going around that there was always some prior knowledge about which ships would be attacked and which wouldn't. The ones under the protection of the City of London, so to speak, were not targeted by pirates. In that context, it's easy to understand how that worked. Now, regarding the current conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, which is basically just a bit further up around the Arabian Peninsula, I don't have any concrete information yet. It's still too recent. But in the end, the mechanisms are always the same.
Aber die Mechanismen sind letztlich ja immer die gleichen.
Diese Insidergeschäfte, die Sie gerade eben erwähnt haben.
those insider trades you just mentioned, could they also have happened around the Iran conflict? I mean, think about it. Donald Trump announces an ultimatum to Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. Then that ultimatum gets extended for several days. At that point, the price of oil drops again by about $15 to $20. And of course, that creates windfall gains for people who were betting on falling prices.
Mitnahmeeffekte für die Leute, die auf sinkende Preise spekuliert haben.
Also diese Insidergeschäfte treten ja bei all diesen
These kinds of insider trades keep showing up whenever there are major global or geopolitical crises, and they're never actually investigated. The most well-known case was after 9/11, with short-selling positions against airlines. And now, in the Iran conflict, it was clear that short contracts worth hundreds of millions were traded, based on prior knowledge that the war was about to start. There was speculation that it might have been Donald Trump's son, Cop Barron Trump. That's just a rumor, of course. But someone did it, yes. And these people make a lot of money from their insider knowledge. As far as I know, there's never been any investigation into it.
Es ist mir nicht bekannt, dass das jemals zu Ermittlungen führte.
Sehen Sie persönlich die City of
Do you
London
personally see the City of London and the international financial industry centered there more as victims of the war against Iran? Or would you say the financial sector is also complicit?
Die Finanzwirtschaft ist auch Mittäter.
Die Finanzwirtschaft ist immer Mittäter. Diejenigen, die
The financial sector is always an accomplice. Those who control the central banks also control the media. And that's a mafia-like structure that's been built up over centuries. In my view, the City of London, or you could say Great Britain as a whole, stands above the United States in that chain of power. Why do I say that? When I worked for that MI6 spin-off company, I met the real M, the one people know from the James Bond movies, played by Judi Dench. The real M actually looks just like Judi Dench, and M is the head of the British intelligence service. Those kinds of code names and abbreviations are typical for the British. It's quite possible that Q, meaning QAnon, was also invented by them as a form of false opposition.
Wahrscheinlich ist auch QAnon von denen erfunden worden als falsche Opposition. Und M, die wir als Judi Dench kennen.
And M, the one we know as Judi Dench, is actually the real-life British security expert who looks just like her, Baroness Neville Jones, a long-time intelligence chief. She was on the payroll of the same company where I worked as a very junior consultant for travel security, mainly for ultra-high net worth individuals, so the ultra-rich who need protection when they travel. And on that same payroll, just to make a point, were two former NSA directors, Keith Alexander and Michael Hayden, so American intelligence chiefs, top intelligence officials on the payroll of a British security firm with close ties to MI6. I found that quite interesting.
Das war für mich interessant.
War ein Motiv für US-Präsident Trump.
Was one of President Trump's motives for starting this war the attempt to grab financial assets, resources, minerals, basically oil and gas, for himself?
Sich unter den Nagel zu reißen.
Das ist ja der rote Faden.
That's really the common thread running through all those American wars of aggression. It's about securing the flow of raw materials, less about the resources themselves, and more about controlling the currencies they're traded in. It has to be the dollar, which is basically a kind of counterfeit money system that's existed since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created. The Fed, in the end, is a criminal enterprise run by private families, from whom citizens have to borrow their money at interest. At the same time, the IRS, the Income Tax Authority, was introduced. Before that, there was no income tax. The idea was that citizens would pay taxes so that the interest could go to those private families who make up the Federal Reserve Bank.
Federal Reserve Bank eben ausmachen. Und das
The power system built around the dollar and the Federal Reserve depends on absolute control over all trade flows, including drugs, and even the major food and grain flows that are tied to the dollar as the leading currency. Sometimes people speculate that this system might soon collapse, paving the way for something new, like a central bank digital currency. Maybe so, but for now, we're still living in a dollar-based system. And when it comes to Iran, meaning British-controlled, bank-controlled, my dentist, who's Persian and whose father had to flee from the mullahs back in 1979, always says, if you lift the mullah's beard, you'll see the Union Jack underneath.
Wenn man beim Mullah den Bart hochhebt, ist der Union Jack drunter zu sehen. Man darf also auch nicht glauben, dass das
So we shouldn't think of them as pure antagonists, as if they're just trying to wipe each other out in a vacuum. There are plenty of back channels, lines of communication, and sometimes even collaborations in places you'd never expect. Take the circumstances under which Ayatollah Khomeini was brought back to Iran as the leader of the revolution, on that Air France flight with the great Peter Scholl-Latour, whom I had the privilege of meeting personally. He was one of my great role models. And as Scholl-Latour himself wrote in his books, he already had Khomeini's constitution in his head at the time. I'm pretty sure that Scholl-Latour worked for several intelligence services, at that moment, maybe for the French. He definitely served the Germans as well, and probably the Israelis too, given his mother's background. Then a new power structure was put in place. The mullahs have been in power ever since, and they're also part of the West's long-term strategy, which has mainly been directed against Russia. There's been talk for many years about something called Operation Greenbelt. The idea that the Americans created a kind of green belt of Islamic governments and systems, stretching from Afghanistan all the way around Russia for geostrategic reasons. This Operation Greenbelt still hasn't been officially confirmed, but many of those individual actions have now been proven through released documents. When it comes to Greenbelt and Iran and how all of that came about, we might still have to wait and see. But these wars are orchestrated. They're made. So we shouldn't put too much hope in the idea that Iran somehow outsmarted or surprised the West with a clever, spontaneous strategy. The outcome we see in the end is always something that was planned in advance. That's been the case with every war.
When President Trump decided to attack Iran, did he miscalculate?
Hat sich da verschätzt?
I assume Trump had nothing to do with that decision. He just has to sell it to the public. Trump himself said that Witkow and Kushner, two of his three most important advisors, the third one, I believe, is Greenblatt, pushed him to do it. On the one hand, there's the possibility that the terrible compromat against Trump, which has now become public through the Epstein files, turned him into a complete pawn, a pawn of those circles, the so-called Israel lobby. From my point of view, the term Epstein War fits perfectly here. I'd even go further and say all wars are Epstein wars.
Ich würde sogar weitergehen, alle Kriege sind Epstein-Kriege. Und ob es jetzt eine
Whether this is a distraction for Trump, giving him a chance to catch his breath before the Epstein papers, investigations, and trials drive him out of office, or whether it came about under pressure from the Israel lobby to strike now, and maybe that's why it's not being carried out as precisely as usual, or whether it actually follows a well-thought-out plan that will become clear from the results. We'll know it by its fruits. I tend to say, don't believe these are random outcomes, like you might still see in sports sometimes. Even there, things are often rigged. I spent a long time in Formula One, but the outcome of this Epstein war will show us what the real intentions were.
Very few people can judge Donald Trump as well as you can, since you've actually dealt with him. What was that like?
I dealt with Trump's companies on two different levels. I never met him personally, but one of his closest friends was, for a while, a colleague of mine. And back in the early 2000s, that friend explained the Trump system to me. At the time, Trump had founded Trump Deutschland AG in Germany, together with Ulrich Marseille and a few German business people. As for Trump's personality, that same businessman described it to me like this. Even back then, he was very closely connected with Jewish capital in the United States. One example was his bankruptcy in Atlantic City with the casinos, where Wilbur Ross from the Rothschild Bank had rescued him. I think that was sometime in the late 1980s.
Ich glaube, das war so in den Ende der 80er. Und
And Trump's lawyer at the time, his name was Friedman, is still a very important figure in the Trump network today. For example, Trump later appointed Friedman as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. So we're talking about two key figures here, Ross and Friedman, who go back to the period when Trump was in serious financial trouble and was essentially rescued by those circles, people to whom he still owes favors. I already knew back then that Trump was a man of gambling, with everything that comes with it. Atlantic City, the Taj Mahal casino, that was his business at the time. And even today, the gambling world remains one of his biggest sources of support. For instance, the Adelson couple, now only Miriam Adelson is still alive, have been among his largest campaign donors ever. And they own a large part of the casino world in Las Vegas, among other things. Then there's another point I learned back then. Trump owns several Trump Towers in New York. Not all of them are that well known. And one of them, I can't recall the exact address right now, but that doesn't matter, is a huge skyscraper. The landlord of that Trump Tower, and the one who also has his own offices there, is Donald Trump himself, along with a Jewish family from Hamburg named Hinneberg. They're not widely known, but you can look it up online. And back then, they already said, Trump is one of us. What does that mean? From my own research and through people I know, Trump has been very, very close to Mossad circles for quite some time.
Ist Trump sehr, sehr eng auch mit Mossad-Kreisen schon gewesen, in Zeiten, wo Adnan Khashoggi der reichste Mann der Welt war.
Back in the days when Adnan Khashoggi was the richest man in the world, I actually met him once. And that yacht, the super yacht that belonged to Khashoggi, was later taken over by Trump. That was also the time when Epstein came onto the scene as a confirmed Mossad agent. They worked very closely together back then. There were also geopolitical scandals going on at the time, like the Iran-Contra affair. So this whole construct around Donald Trump has been brewing for a long time. And really you have to say, he's a kind of golem, a dull forerunner and helper of Orthodox Judaism.
Des orthodoxen Judentums. Der Golem ist vielleicht heutzutage nicht mehr so geläufig den Menschen.
The golem might not be that familiar to people today, but for anyone who wants to look into it, Rabbi Low in Prague was the first, at least in literature, to really make this figure tangible. The idea that Orthodox Jews would create a compliant helper out of clay. The name actually comes from goy made of clay, or goylem. Goy is a derogatory term for non-Jews. So, a goy made of clay, the golem, is brought to life when the rabbi places the word emet on its tongue or on its forehead. Emet means truth, and it's that truth that sets the golem in motion, serving the interests of those groups. And when the golem is supposed to be shut down again, the rabbi removes the first letter, the E, and what's left is met. Met, like in Methuselah, means death. That's when the golem, the helper, is laid to rest. And in Prague, in the Old New Synagogue, that's what it's called, the mythical figure of the golem is said to rest to this day on the upper floor. That's how the story goes. No one is allowed to enter that space. There's a door you can look at, but no one may go inside. It's really just a mythological story. But someone like Trump is exactly that, a golem of those circles.
What does Mossad have on Trump?
I'd say that Mossad and Trump have always worked together. The compromising material from the Epstein files is, so to speak, a kind of data reserve that gets used when someone needs to be pushed into doing things they wouldn't do on their own, like starting a major war, for example. And anyone can look at the Epstein files themselves. Even in the part that's publicly available, and that's only half of 6 million documents, there's already more than enough in there to bring down a president.
Ist genügend drin, einen Präsidenten zu stürzen, gar keine Frage. Also mit viel zu jungen Mädchen.
No question about it. He did things with girls who were far too young, things that were absolutely illegal, and possibly even worse things we don't know about, things that are hinted at in the Epstein files. For example, there's talk of a girl who died and was supposedly buried on a golf course, or the claim that he had sexual fantasies involving his own daughter. All of that is deeply disturbing, and that alone would be enough to have leverage over Trump.
Das genügt schon, Trump in der Hand zu haben.
Was Trump pushed into a war with Iran by Mossad by Netanyahu?
Ich denke schon.
I think so. During his first term, Trump actually came across as a surprisingly peaceful American president. That was always part of his style, the way he wanted to present himself. And now, like every one of his predecessors, he's triggered and bears responsibility for a terrible war of aggression. There are those images showing how dramatically he's aged in such a short time. It's possible he has enough of a conscience to suffer, I hope so, when he sees that, at the start of the Iran war, there was essentially a satanic ritual. The bombing of the girls' school in Minab, where around 180 people, mostly children, lost their lives.
Im Wesentlichen Kinder ums Leben kamen, was ein gezielter Doppelschlag war, double tap.
It was a deliberate double strike, a so-called double tap. First, a large number of school children were killed, and then about 40 minutes later, the teachers, medics, and rescue workers who had rushed in to help were hit as well. That's a level of evil I actually heard about the very same day from an Iranian friend who's very well informed. At first, I didn't even want to believe him, that it had really happened that way, that this war had been started with such malice, almost like a satanic ritual. But by now, I've come to share that view, because it's been proven that it was an American warship, and 2 responsible officers have already been shown in the mainstream media. Officially, they say it was just mistakes caused by wrongly programmed data. But the ritualized violence, the satanically motivated act of war, is also part of the Epstein system. Especially when you look into those disgusting things that no sane person even wants to talk about. Things that were already proven in Pizzagate, and that people are now actually starting to notice out on the streets. Horrifying things that, in fact, run through the entire history of Central Europe. And yes, this satanic nature of these people, of this kind of warfare, is something we simply can't stomach. It's that terrible. And maybe Trump also took that on board. Maybe that's why he became the originator, or at least partly responsible, for such a dreadful act of war.
Is a war against Iran the final nail in the coffin for Donald Trump?
Well, right now, I'd say, there's no way Trump can come out of this unscathed. And then you have to ask yourself, how is it possible that someone who's played along with the system for so long suddenly gets dropped by that same system? He really shouldn't be surprised. History is full of examples like that. Even if we just look at more recent history, Gaddafi worked very closely with the West for a long time. He even coordinated several terrorist groups for the British, the ETA, or Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, where I was on the ground myself. He also cooperated closely with Israel, and still, in the end, he was brutally humiliated. Gaddafi was impaled, even though he'd worked with the system for years. Assad, too, has done a lot to maintain a proper working relationship with the West. He also did something terrible. Around 2003 and 2004, during the time when armies from Afghanistan were kidnapping people and sending them to Guantanamo and other places to extract confessions through torture, he took part in that, working with the West, for example, in Syria under Assad, and back then also in Morocco. But Assad never got any gratitude for it. And it's important to remember, Saddam Hussein, who had worked very closely with the West, was lured into the Kuwait trap after fighting a long proxy war against Iran. And as a reward, Saddam Hussein was ultimately murdered in misery. The point is, you can't make a pact with the devil and think you'll be protected forever. And I'd say Trump is going to find that out too.
And Trump wanted to turn the war in Ukraine, which the Americans basically triggered with the coup on the Maidan in 2014, into a European issue. Has that been successful? How do you see it? You've been in the war zone yourself.
On a meta level, I think the way this war is being conducted is far beyond the control of presidents, especially someone like Trump. This kind of warfare is being designed by completely different circles. And right now, it's about the fact that NATO is no longer the protective power, for example, against Russia. The Americans are pulling back, and the EU is left to deal with the mess. And it's not some erratic, clumsy figure like Trump making that call. It's other geopolitical strategists who are saying, let's once again pit the 2 major powers in Europe against each other, Central Europe, especially Germany, and Russia. That's what they call the balance of power, put politely. Or, going back to Halford Mackinder's time, the Heartland Doctrine. The idea is that the heartland has to be divided, meaning between Russia and Germany, so that global power stays in the hands of the Anglo-Saxons, especially the Anglo-Americans. And right now, from my point of view, we're in the early stage of a major war between Germany and Russia, for the third time in 120 years. And as a German, I'm deeply ashamed of that. This withdrawal of the Americans from our alliance is paving the way for it, because Germany is certainly not meant to win in the end. In these wars, it's usually many Germans and many Russians who die. And unfortunately, that's what's coming.
Das wird kommen, leider. Und ja,
Yes, I've been to the Donbass myself, 3 times, and I think it was during my second visit. So the first one was in 2015, then the second in 2018. After talking with local people there, that I made the prediction this war would expand and that we as Germans would get drawn into it. Now, one could say this might be our first step toward liberation from foreign control by the Americans, which, frankly, would be something to wish for, because since 1945, we've been, in my view, under a kind of de facto occupation through the presence of their troops, or even a de jure one, reflected in the UN Enemy State Clause and in the fact that the Americans have extensive rights to let their intelligence services operate in Germany, even against Germans.
ihre Geheimdienste tätig sein zu lassen, auch gegen Deutsche. Und vor allem durch die ideologische Besatzung.
And above all, through the ideological occupation by McDonald's and rap music, all that junk we've been forced to take in for the past 80 years. If we could free ourselves from that, that would actually be the good news, if the Americans are now pulling back. But the bad news is that the road to liberation leads straight into the next big conflict. One we're certainly not going to win, and one that will once again bring harm and misery to both Germans and Russians. That's my prediction.
Spinoza hat geschrieben, gefragt.
Spinoza once asked, "Why do you long for your own subjugation as if it were your salvation?" So why do the German elites long for subjugation to America? Why are they letting themselves be drawn once again into the swamp of war?
Warum lassen sie sich in den Sumpf des Krieges erneut hineinziehen?
Auf 100 Fragen ist 99 Mal die Antwort Geld. Ja. Das sind
Out of 100 questions, 99 times the answer is money. These are networks where everyone benefits from one another. The foreign control I just described shows up in mandates like BlackRock and in our current system. But it also shows up through connections to networks where people get fancy titles and awards from groups like the Atlantic Bridge or the Council on Foreign Relations, organizations that cater to their vanity. And for about 80 years now, they've settled comfortably into these circles, a kind of comfort zone, at least for the current elites in Germany, who have always looked only to the West.
immer nur nach Westen orientiert waren. Ja. Man würde sich ja wünschen, dass wir auch
You'd really hope that we could find a more neutral position for ourselves, somewhere between East and West. Because after all, Germans are in many ways a people of the East, an Eastern people. That's true because of our origins, because the prime meridian runs through Greenwich, London, and Paris, and because of many values we share with our neighbors to the East. But all right, for the past 80 years we've been taught and shaped by the ways of the West. And this idea of salvation that Spinoza describes, the one our elites are chasing there, might make sense for them personally in their own cost-benefit calculation. But for those who give them legitimacy, the German people, the German voters, it makes no sense at all. It actually works against us. And we've been suffering from that for a very long time.
Aber darunter leiden wir schon sehr lange und ich bin ja auch
And I'm someone who says this. The dominance of Western values has been very harmful to the Germans over the past 80 or maybe even 100, 105 years, ever since Germany was basically taken over by foreign forces in 1918. That didn't just start in 1945, it began earlier. The Germans don't seem to have much of their own spiritual strength left, and their leaders even less so. The strength of the German people has worn down through major conflicts, going back as far as the 30 Years' War. You could go very deep into why all that was imposed on us. Even today, there's not much left. On top of that, the German is an easily seduced, easily deceived person, a character that embodies what Jonathan Swift described in Gulliver more than 300 years ago.
Swift schon vor 300 Jahren in Gulliver beschrieben hat.
Gullivers Reisen.
Gullivers Reisen.
Gulliver's Travels. He's kind of a clumsy giant, if you will, almost like a golem, wandering through the world, constantly stepping into trouble and having to go through all sorts of crazy experiences. The name Gulliver actually comes from the English word gullible, meaning easily deceived, naive, easy to fool. Those are traits that aren't unique to Germans, but unfortunately, we have them to a particular degree. And that's why we're in this predicament. I don't see any inner strength in Germany, much as I wish I did, that could help us pull ourselves out of this mess, lift ourselves up by our own hair, so to speak, and deal with the conflicts that keep being imposed on us, like the current one with Russia. They don't lead to any kind of healing, just as the Persians weren't liberated by American bombings.
When our elites act the way they do, is that betrayal?
From my point of view, there have been many acts of betrayal since 1918, since 1945. Let's take 1918, for example. Germany fell into new hands through a coup that no one ever talks about. And from 1945, or shortly after, came Adenauer, who definitely betrayed German interests through his policy of alignment with the West. We could have had those interests secured back then. Stalin had offered them. Many German prisoners of war had to die because Adenauer betrayed them. And later on, there were certainly many other cases that could be called betrayal. For instance, when the gates were opened for migration to be used as a weapon. Unfortunately, betrayal is inherent in every system, and with people who are especially gullible and unsuspecting, betrayal is particularly easy.
Sie waren unterwegs auf der Blutspur der Deutschen.
You were following the blood trail of German history in the Donbass, where the largest tank battle in history took place during World War II, the Battle of Kursk in the Kursk region. You rode with the Night Wolves, a Russian biker club, from Crimea to Donetsk. You know the president of the Night Wolves, known as the Surgeon. How did you get in touch with him?
Der Nachtwölfe Chirurg. Wie sind Sie an ihn rangekommen?
In the
tank battle of Kursk, my grandfather served as a doctor. He was one of the few who survived, but he never wanted to talk about the war. So later, when he was quite old, I had to piece together bits of information myself. And yes, I could never have imagined that we'd once again find ourselves in a conflict being forced on us against Russia. How did I personally end up in this conflict? Pretty much by accident. When you want to travel to every country in the world, and you look at all those lists of places you can go, in 2015 I got the idea to visit these two new entities or constructs, the People's Republic of Luhansk and the People's Republic of Donetsk, simply because they existed. I didn't have any political background or political interests. I just thought, in my circle of country collectors, it would be really exciting to be the first one to go there. Sure, there were strict travel warnings in Germany, but I also knew that the Minsk II peace agreement had just been signed, so there really shouldn't have been any fighting going on in 2015. So I flew in through Rostov-on-Don, took 2 taxis across the border into Donetsk, all on my own. And when I got there, I found things were fairly orderly. There were a lot of impact sites, though, bomb craters, shrapnel, some of it even right at the border station with Russia. But at that moment, it was peaceful. I was sitting at the hotel, out on the terrace, in May or June, beautiful weather, and suddenly it started to rumble. I looked around, the sun was shining, I didn't understand it. So I asked my waiter, "Please, can you help me? Is a storm coming?" And he said, "No, that's artillery." I said, "What? But you've got at least 2 peace agreements." He said, "No, we're being shelled every day from west to east." That's when I first realized what was really happening, that this war was being continued as a war of attrition, and that a lot of civilians were affected, because back then, it was mainly the West that was firing on civilian areas.
Wesentlichen hat der Westen auf zivile Gebiete geschossen damals. Ich glaube, die offizielle Zahl sind 14.000, 15.000 Zivilisten.
I think the official number is around 14 or 15,000 civilians, mostly killed by the West. That's what first opened my eyes to this conflict. Then, 3 years later, in 2018, I went back. By then, I already had a connection through a friend I'd met on the Druzhba peace ride. Even back then, I could sense that something was happening again between Germany and Russia. I'd read about it online and took part in that friendship trip from Berlin to Moscow. And one of the young Russians there said to me, "You should come visit Crimea sometime."
Dort hat gesagt, komm doch mal auf die Krim zu den Nachtwölfen, die jährliche
About the Night Wolves, their annual bike show is a huge spectacle, really exciting. That was in Crimea in 2018. So I went there with 3 friends from Munich, and that's where I met the Night Wolves, including their leader, the very charismatic guy they call the Surgeon. He got that nickname because he's actually a trained maxillofacial surgeon. His real name is Alexander Saldostanov. And I also met his second-in-command, their foreign minister, Sven, who has German roots. We became friends, talked a lot, and they actually helped me get into Donetsk during my 3rd trip to the Donbass.
In den Donbass, nach Donetsk überhaupt reinzukommen. Da war nämlich noch härtestes Corona-Regime.
Back then, there was still the strictest COVID regime in place. On that second trip, I was mostly traveling with a driver from the Night Wolves, but I was able to get in without any problems on my own. And I actually had a pretty tough experience there, one of my hardest war experiences in 2018, in Donetsk. I spent about half a day, 6 or 7 hours, waiting in what they called the Separatist Cafe for the then president of the Donetsk People's Republic, Alexander Zakharchenko. He never showed up because there was a lot going on at the front back then, already in 2018. People here often think the war only started in 2022, but no, it's been going on since 2014.
That means the Russians stepped into a war that was already underway. Absolutely.
The movement, as it happened, was that through the coup, which was financed by the West, by people like Victoria Nuland, Soros, and Kolomoisky, power was seized in that coup, and the legally elected government of Yanukovych was forced out of the country, to put it politely. And then came the suppression of Russian interests across the country, especially in the east, in the Donbass, which is largely Russian-speaking. The Russian language was banned in public life, in schools, and so on. Payments were also cut off. Then there was even a ground assault, and at times airstrikes on eastern Ukrainian territory by the new coup leaders in Kiev. That went all the way to the border in some areas. I personally saw shells and shrapnel at the border station in Matviv-Kurgan, between Rostov-on-Don and Donetsk, where there had been heavy fighting, major battles and encirclements. The encirclement at Debaltseve eventually led to the Minsk II peace agreement.
Because the Ukrainian forces were surrounded by the separatists.
Exactly. The separatists had trapped not only soldiers from western Ukraine in that Debaltseve pocket, but also many Western mercenaries. But the crucial point, based on the information I had at the time, was that between 50 and 70 French and German advisors, including officers, were inside that pocket. And that's why both François Hollande and Angela Merkel flew to Minsk under enormous pressure and urgency, a trip they would never have made voluntarily, to reach an agreement under the mediation of Belarusian President Lukashenko. Putin also flew in so they could find a face-saving way to get the German participants in the fighting out of that pocket. And that became the Minsk II peace agreement. What we now know from our great leader at the time is that it was only signed to buy time, to eventually carry out the war, to keep fighting against Russia, and possibly to win it. Back then, the West started to dig in, building that belt around Luhansk and Donetsk, which Russian forces still haven't completely broken through to this day. So I witnessed all of that step by step.
Also das habe ich alles sukzessive mitbekommen, und als ich im Separatistencafé
When I was waiting in the separatist cafe for then-President Zakharchenko, I had some great conversations. The atmosphere was really fascinating. It was kind of like a Planet Hollywood, set up by the separatists, with camouflage nets and mortars used as drink or bottle holders. But he never showed up. Too bad. A week later, when I was already back in Germany, he was killed by a bomb at the entrance to that same cafe, along with his bodyguard. So I have a very personal connection to that place, which was in a way something special in that war back then.
Who's behind this attack? Do you have any idea or suspicion?
That could only have been the western part of Ukraine. Theoretically, you could also say there were things going on among the rebels themselves again. Stuff like that is often spread around to rub salt in the wound. I can't say for sure, but Zakharchenko was quite popular with the locals. You know that yourself.
Wissen, dass auf beiden Seiten im Ukraine-Krieg Tschetschenen unterwegs
I also know that Chechen mercenaries are fighting on the western Ukrainian side. You've spoken with Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government. You know him personally. What's going on there? What's really going on?
Sie kennen ihn persönlich. Was wird da gespielt?
The fact that Chechens are fighting on both sides in this war has to do with Ramzan Kadyrov, whose father was already the president of Chechnya and was later killed by a bomb. Kadyrov's father and his son Ramzan have always been aligned with Moscow. They made a deal with Moscow, and in my view, that deal was also necessary because Russia, the Russian Federation, can never allow a Caucasus state to leave the Federation. That would open a strategic gateway for all kinds of powers. Moscow has to keep that belt in the Caucasus. And Ramzan Kadyrov, in order to hold on to his power after those two major Chechen wars, which were heavily driven by the West, well, even George W. Bush was urged by Putin around 2000 or 2001 not to let any more rebels in. These were Western-funded Muslim extremists, terrorists, coming through Azerbaijan and Georgia, the ones who carried out the Beslan school massacre, or the bombings, the Bolshoi theater attack. Those assaults were orchestrated by the West. Kadyrov managed to prevail, but with toughness. The Chechens are the toughest people in the world, but also among the most fascinating. I really enjoy being there. It's a highly cultured people who think differently from us. The Chechens say, "My son must be able to do two things, fight and dance." And they truly are born fighters. The losers of Kadyrov's power takeover, or his consolidation of power, went to the West. They're against Kadyrov, and they're fighting for Western Ukraine. That's why there are Chechens on both sides. I only know the ones in the east, the ones based in Grozny, who also went to war. And my friends, people my age, so older guys, who were near Kiev back then, they went involuntarily. For Russia, for Chechnya, for Kadyrov. They would have liked to fight and end the war right away. But they're not fighting anymore, my friends, because they quickly realized this war is being fought differently. It was meant to drag on. And when they were in Zaporizhzhia with Chechens, on the eastern side, those were basically assault units at the front. And that was certainly intense. I was only in the Donetsk area myself, but not with Chechens. I was with the Night Wolves.
You've met Kadyrov and sat down with him several times. How should I picture this Chechen leader?
Charismatic, unusual, and very, very warm-hearted, at least if you're on good terms with him. Extremely generous, very engaging. He doesn't try to play the villain himself. He's got other people for that. I also met Adam Delimkhanov, and there used to be a very well-known Chechen, Umar Delimkhanov, who just recently died, apparently by suicide. He was extremely close to him. So there are some truly extraordinary characters among the Chechens. Basically, the Chechens cleaned up and brought the entire Russian underworld under control for Putin. That's why Russia has become so safe since Putin took power in the early 2000s. I was able to see that on all my trips.
Anfang 2000. Ich konnte das beobachten bei allen Reisen.
How did they do that?
Also die verschiedenen
So, the different centrifugal forces in Russia often come from its ethnic groups. Russia, the Russian Federation, is a multi-ethnic state with around 120 peoples. I once gave a speech at the end of that Druzhba trip at the United Nations of Russia. That's a kind of assembly hall where all the different ethnic groups of Russia come together. And some of those groups have traditionally had a tendency toward criminal behavior. Putin had to clean things up in his country.
Die Unruhe und die Unsicherheit und
The unrest, the uncertainty, and those mafia-like structures really came about because of perestroika and glasnost, brought in from the West through their vassal Gorbachev, whom I actually met once in person. Under Yeltsin, the drunk, that all led to terrible conditions in Russia, where even Russians themselves often didn't feel comfortable. Many people emigrated back then because they found life in Russia too unstable, especially toward the end of the 90s. Putin cleaned that up, and the Chechens were also a power factor in that process. The alliance between Moscow and Grozny is important, geopolitically on the outside, but also domestically, to maintain control over those criminal underworld circles that, in that form, simply don't exist anymore today. Russia is a safe country.
Russland ist ein sicheres Land, Inter.
You also spent time with the FARC rebels in Colombia. How did you end up there?
Das ist ein Zufallsprodukt meiner
That actually came about by chance, through my extreme travel activities. A hotel owner in Colombia, Jack Goldstein, he's been to around 130 countries and is also active in my community, wanted to meet the heroes of the extreme travel scene. So he created an event in his own country, in Colombia, where we all flew in from around the world under the banner of my organization, ETHIC. ETHIC stands for Extreme Traveler International Congress. Once a year, the most well-traveled people in the world meet there, and they always want to go somewhere exciting. And Jack Goldstein offered to take us to the founding region of the FARC.
Wir fahren in das Gründungsgebiet der FARC. In den Bergen, in den Anden,
In the mountains, in the Andes, where no foreigners had been since around 1950 or 60 because it was too dangerous. We even went to the hut where Manuel Marulanda founded the FARC back then. But even for the FARC leaders who were with us, we had the entire leadership, from number 1 to number 7. It was an emotional experience, moving them to tears to come back to that place. They hadn't experienced that before either. And the FARC, which is far left, communist, I really have no sympathy for their ideas. Still, for me it was maybe the most fascinating trip I've ever taken, from a geopolitical point of view, because it was so genuine, so real.
Es war so echt, es war real, es war nicht durch Medien transportiert, ich habe es nicht im Buch.
It wasn't something I picked up from the media, and I didn't read it in a book. I was actually there with Timoshenko, the number 1 of the FARC, and with the Dutch rebel leader Tanja Nijmeijer, who herself is already something of a legend, almost like a real-life Lara Croft, and with other FARC leaders, traveling in a convoy under the protection of special police and the military, even under the patronage of the Colombian president. Right there, in the mountains, in an area that for decades had been incredibly dangerous. And that's what really moved me, to see the truth with my own eyes and form my own picture of what's happening. In Colombia, you learn, for example, that there's actually a kind of geopolitical tension war going on there too, one that's been simmering ever since the Americans took over the Panama Canal.
Seit die Amerikaner den Panama-Kanal übernommen haben, die haben den von den Franzosen eigentlich
You could say they basically swiped it from the French. Back in the 1910s, maybe it was 1908, the Americans sparked a revolution that split Panama off from Colombia and turned it into its own republic, just so they could control the Panama Canal. That canal, of course, is an extremely important geostrategic route, still under American control today. It also physically separated from Colombia, so to speak. The area between Colombia and Panama was left to grow wild. It's pure jungle now. You can't really get through there anymore. So if someone drives the Pan American Highway from Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, they have to find another way to cross those 70 kilometers of jungle.
anderweitig überwinden. Mit dem Schiff, mit dem Flugzeug. Das ist ein
By ship, by plane. That was a geopolitical move by the Americans to divide Colombia and separate Panama while keeping the tension alive. And that tension has been maintained ever since through this kind of terror that back in the day actually took place in coordination with the Soviet Union. Because for a long time the question was, were these groups supported by the Soviets as far-left communists? On the Western side, you had the military and the police forces, but also, in part, extreme death squads. So you really can't draw a clear line between good and evil there. What mattered was that the conflict existed, and in fact, that conflict still continues in Colombia today.
Den gibt es bis heute eigentlich noch in Kolumbien.
Und den ganzen Konflikt beschreiben Sie auch.
And you describe the whole conflict in your book, I Survived.
Und dort
In it, you also explain why you're traveling, because you believe you can only understand the truth if you've actually been there yourself. And then you write, the Germans are the most brainwashed people in the world. What do you mean by that?
Hirngewaschenste Volk der Welt. Wie das?
Der Untertitel meines Buches heißt ja Auf Wahrheitssuche in den gefährlichsten
The subtitle of my book is In Search of Truth in the World's Most Dangerous Places.
Wir werden
In Germany, that search for truth is especially dangerous. For a very long time, we've been fed narratives that work to the detriment of the German people. I'll deliberately leave out the period of the Second World War for now. The real question is how Germany was founded under Bismarck. In my view, that was already planned, to make the previously well-functioning, thousand-year-old Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which had been very decentralized, both capable of attack and vulnerable to attack. For example, through the Entente Cordiale, which around 1906 or 1908 brought together England, France, and Russia to attack Germany, something that was then carried out in the First World War.
Deutschland anzugreifen, was dann im Ersten Weltkrieg auch umgesetzt wurde. Das wäre durch Bismarck, ohne Bismarck nicht möglich gewesen.
That wouldn't have been possible without Bismarck. That's why I take a critical view of him. He corrupted Bavaria, and in my opinion, he introduced the disastrous system of statutory health insurance as a kind of glue to bind the Germans together as a nation, along with a few other clever maneuvers. I actually learned it the other way around. Yes, these are things I've come to understand for myself, to deprogram from the official version of history. He was financed by Bleichroeder. Then came our emperor, who, during the 30 or 35 years he ruled Germany, didn't wage a single war. Yet he was made fully responsible for the First World War, which, even in the mainstream today, can no longer really be maintained.
Was ja auch heute im Mainstream nicht mehr zu halten ist, ja.
It was imposed on the German people.
Ja, wir haben bezahlt bis 2010. Die
Yes,
Reparationen
we kept paying reparations for the Treaty of Versailles all the way up to 2010, a treaty that came about through what I'd call high treason. Funny enough, there's one detail I remember. Why did Germany only start having Flixbuses and long-distance buses around 2010? Because up until then, every train ticket still included a portion that went toward those reparations, all the way back to the Versailles payments. And how did Versailles even come about? On November 9th, 1918, probably the most brutal betrayal of Germany took place. Up to that point, Germany had been leading in World War I. The front was right outside Paris. That's why our representative, he was a delegate, was sent to Compiègne, a suburb of Paris. I actually went there myself to see where, in that famous train car in Compiègne, that delegate signed a total capitulation, one that completely turned the reality of the war upside down.
Die Realität des Krieges völlig auf den Kopf stellt.
Das wirkt wie eine neue Dolchstoßlegende.
It feels like a new stab-in-the-back legend. And it was one. That's why the term still resonates, because it's true. When Erzberger, that's his name in Compiègne, arrived there on November 9th, 1918, it had taken him 2 days to get there. On that same day, there was a coup in Germany, though it's never called that. People say it was a revolution, that democracy was introduced. But in reality, the Kaiser was deposed through the high treason of his prime minister, Max von Baden, who was vulnerable to blackmail because of his homosexuality and his relationship with his office manager or secretary, Kurt Hahn. Max von Baden announced the Kaiser's abdication without the Kaiser knowing anything about it. And of course, someone like General Groner, for example, was also against the Kaiser, and you always need military backing.
Would you say the emperor left, but the generals stayed?
You could put it that way. I don't know if all the generals stayed. Many of them probably joined the Freikorps afterward, trying to undo what they saw as high treason. But in the long run, of course, that didn't succeed.
That's exactly the argument the National Socialists used. They talked about high treason because of the Treaty of Versailles.
Ich will nicht über die Nationalsozialisten sprechen, weil diese Dinge sind zu belastet in Deutschland, was da passiert ist. Aber natürlich sind auch die Nationalsozialisten vom Westen groß gemacht worden, finanziert worden. Dazu kann man Bücher lesen wie Guido Preparata, Conjuring Hitler oder Anthony Sutton über wie Wall Street sowohl Hitler als auch die Bolschewiken finanzierte.
The Founder of Israel by Henneke Kardal. There are quite a few books like that. You can take them on board or not.
These connections really aren't part of the public awareness. But why is that exactly? Where do you see today that Germans are the most brainwashed people?
An solchen Episoden wie 1918.
Episodes like what happened in 1918, which, by the way, is told to us in a completely different way. And then later with Adenauer after 1945, we've seen that before. And the situation in Germany today is still one of foreign control, which shows itself especially in the cultural sphere. What we see in the media is Western trash. It's junk. Who among us can hum a Russian song or a Chinese one or anything else? We've been dumbed down by this Western hegemon, just like their own people have. The Dumbing Down of America, United States. That's a book by Charlotte Iserbyt. This dumbing down, this destruction of intellect, of the cultural greatness we once had, we can feel that very clearly in this country. We're at the end here.
Wir sind am Ende hier.
Wer die Wahrheit erkennen will,
anyone who wants to see the truth for themselves has to go and take a look on the ground, says Kolja Spöri, a world traveler, a reporter who's been to some of the most dangerous places on earth. Thank you very much for that. Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide.
Propagandamedien verschweigen.